Hi, everyone. My name is Ken, and today I'd like to share with you some of our work related to 3D electrical resistance tomography and how we can use that method to localize damage in cellular lattice structures. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, in particular, Ms. Yening Xu, my PhD student leading this work, as well as our collaborators from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, including Saptarshi, Tammy, Abigail, Joe, and Dave. To motivate this work, I like to focus our attention in looking at advanced aerospace structures. And in particular, as we look at the next generation of these aerospace structures, we know that additively manufactured parts are beginning to play a more important role since they enable the design and fabrication of highly complex geometries and high performance structures. In particular, cellular lattice structures have been of main interest simply due to their high strength and high stiffness to weight ratios. However, at the same time, we know that these complex cellular lattice structures, with an example shown on the bottom left, can also suffer from defects in the form of voids, fabrication errors, and breakages that can occur during manufacturing, as well as in service when these structures are subjected to expected and unexpected loads. Now, if we think about how to detect damage in these particular aerospace structures, there's also numerous challenges at the structural scale. First, we know that these structures are generally very large, and damage can be distributed in any location within these structures. And they can be part of even non-planar components. So the first question that we want to answer is, well, how can we sense efficiently over large structural surfaces, and not necessarily just on the surface itself, but also within the structure too? Second, as indicated in the previous slide, we know that cellular lattice structures can have highly complex geometries and very intricate part designs. So the second question is, how can we detect damage in these particularly complex structures and be able to localize them? Last but not least, because these cellular lattice structures also can develop these non-traditional damage modalities where damage may not be necessarily combined to structural surfaces, the third question is, how can we visualize subsurface structural damage and be able to effectively localize specifically where these parts are broken and need attention? Now, if we examine the current methods and the current state of the art that are used to detect defects in lattice structures, several different techniques have been proposed and used, and they include the use and embedment of discrete sensors in these additively manufactured components. People have used ultrasonic testing as well, or ultrasonic tomography, or leveraging radiographic methods such as computed tomography to generate a detailed image of these lattice structures and components. However, we also know that these techniques suffer from some inherent challenges, where, for instance, with the use of discrete sensors, they are effectively point sensors, and we can only obtain information where these sensors are instrumented. Ultrasonic testing can require very dense transducers rays and typically entail very complicated wave propagation patterns in order to reconstruct an accurate representation of the entire structure and where damage might be located. Last but not least, to obtain a high resolution CT image, we know that multiple projection slices are typically needed, and this particular method is expensive and computationally intensive, not to mention that they are not necessarily scalable to look at entire full-scale structural components. With these limitations in mind, this work aims to address some of those challenges by employing electrical resistance tomography, or ERT, in order to localize damage in these cellular lattice structures, where we believe that ERT can provide sufficient spatial resolution and is a relatively cheap and convenient technique in order to perform damage detection. Now, before going into the details of what we are doing in this particular work, I'd like to quickly provide a background on electrical resistance tomography. So if we think about conventional ERT, they have been applied in many different fields, including biomedical engineering, as well as non-destructive evaluation and structural health monitoring. But a lot of the times, ERT is applied to these two-dimensional planar conductive targets, if you will. And they entail the instrumentation of a network or an array of these boundary electrodes along the edges of your conductive target. By injecting an electrical current through a pair of electrodes and measuring the corresponding voltage distribution at the other boundary electrodes, the goal is then to solve an inverse problem to reconstruct the conductivity distribution or spatial conductivity map of your conductive body. Now, you can also imagine that if damage were to occur in this conductive structure itself, it would in turn change the conductivity distribution and cause your electrical current propagation path to also change, which in turn affects the voltages that you measure along the boundaries. So simply by solving this inverse problem and relating the input current with the boundary voltage measurements, the goal is to then identify conductivity changes that are indicative of not only whether damage has occurred, but also to pinpoint exactly where they are located. Now, in this particular project, we wish to extend conventional ERT, but move beyond a two-dimensional or planar structure to apply them to these three-dimensional bodies, but in addition to these highly patterned cellular lattice type of structures. With some of the challenges associated with ERT, we've also implemented this normalized sensitivity map in order to improve the connectivity reconstruction quality of the method itself, and in turn would improve the ability to visualize where these defects are located. In the final part of the presentation, I'll also show you some of our latest work in looking at a data-driven approach to also improve damage localization performance. So the goal, as you can imagine, is with these 3D cellular lattice structures, you can easily apply boundary electrodes to existing parts or even parts that are being manufactured and be able to interrogate them, obtain those corresponding measurements to quickly visualize where damages may have occurred. So to begin the study, we started with a generic structure that is representative of one of the simplest cellular lattice structures that we can imagine, which in this case is a 3x3x1 cubic unit cell. It has a total of 64 struts, or these linear elements, as you see here. And for our, in this particular work, we looked at both numerical simulations as well as experimental testing. And I'll begin this discussion with the numerical simulations first. So we assume that the conductivity of the undamaged structure has a value of 1,000 Siemens per meter. Then we can instrument boundary electrodes. In this case, 24 of these electrodes were attached to where the struts intersected along both planes, on top and on bottom. And we applied a planar adjacent current injection pattern in order to produce a total of 504 boundary voltages acquired. The entire model was meshed in Abacus with tetrahedral elements. And to simulate damage within this cubic unit cell, we can assign particular elements to basically have a conductivity of 0, which indicates a full breakage at that particular location. And we can do this to individual finite elements. Now, one of the challenges with ERT, and especially as we look into the third dimension, is the fact that as we move away from the boundary electrodes, the sensitivity of your boundary voltage measurements to changes in conductivity, particularly in the central region, becomes highly diminished, right? And as a result of that low sensitivity, if we use our as acquired boundary voltages to reconstruct their conductivity distribution, we will likely obtain a lot of image artifacts and can even have inaccurate reconstructed connectivity maps. So to improve our method, we've implemented this so-called strut-based normalized sensitivity map, where we can begin while producing the sensitivity map as part of the ERT algorithm to look at how different elements affect the boundary voltages that we collected, and in turn apply this normalization matrix to our final sensitivity map to essentially enhance and correct for the low central sensitivity within the EIT method itself, or the ERT method itself. So to examine how the normalized sensitivity map compares with a conventional 3D ERT algorithm, we considered, again, our generic cellular lattice structure, in this case, with a single damaged location, which is a full breakage at this particular strut, which we're calling strut number 1. We could then numerically simulate and inject a current following the adjacent current injection pattern to then solve the forward problem to calculate the corresponding boundary voltages. Using those calculated boundary voltages, we can then use them as inputs to this ERT inverse problem. And again, solved without the normalized sensitivity map and solved with the normalized sensitivity map. And these plots basically show you the conductivity values that are reconstructed, plotted as a function of the total number of finite elements within this model. And what you can see here, and the takeaway from this slide, is that without the normalized sensitivity map, we effectively see not only a lot of noise in the reconstructed signals, but we also obtain some image artifacts where damage is not located. The red square, dash square highlights where the elements corresponding to strut 1 are located. But even though we correctly identify that there are broken struts at this location, we see that in other spots, there are conductivity changes as well, which is not the case. Instead, with a normalized sensitivity map, we can clearly identify where the strut breakage occurred. And then by solving the inverse problem, we can also directly visualize the connectivity distribution, as you can see here on the left-hand side, where strut 1 shows this blue colored versus the other red values, indicating where which strut has broken. Now, we can also assess the performance of this damage detection approach by defining 2 metrics: position error as well as area error, which basically assesses how accurate we are at identifying the location and the size of damage. And in this table below, we see that, of course, without a normalized sensitivity map, we see some error values relative to the normalized sensitivity map where we precisely identified where damage was located. Now, similarly, we can also extend this numerical simulation study to look at not 1, but 2 damage cases where we have 2 broken struts. Again, one in strut 1 and another complete breakage in strut number 2. Again, the message here is similar, where without a normalized sensitivity map, we see a lot of noise and image artifacts, even though we correctly identify the significant reduction in conductivity at these broken struts. But in contrast to the use of a normalized sensitivity map, we can very accurately determine where those broken struts are. Again, visualizing the 3D connectivity distribution, we can clearly see where those broken struts are located. Now, once we verified the performance of our 3D ERT method using numerical studies, we then validated this method through some experimental tests. Shown here on the bottom left here is our experimental setup, where we have a custom ERT data acquisition system that employs a multifunctional switch with an embedded digital multimeter that is coupled with an AC/DC current source. And all of this is controlled using a MATLAB-based interface. We 3D printed the same cellular lattice grid structure, in this case using polylactic acid. But in order to create a conductive body where we can physically inject an electrical current, we spray coated this particular structure with this sacrificial multi-walled carbon nanotube-based coating in order to, again, provide for a conductive structure. The sacrificial layer was also very convenient because we can easily implement damage simply by etching off a portion of the film at any location. In this case, strut number 1. So upon doing that, we can, again, collect our inject current, collect our boundary voltages, run through the ERT inverse problem with the normalized conductivity, normalized sensitivity map, and again, clearly identify the location of our broken strut, which is visualized here on the right-hand side as well. Similarly, we can also etch off coding and not just strut number 1, but also strut number 2. And again, with the normalized sensitivity map approach, we can clearly localize damage in these 2 correct locations and see that the error is in fact 0 as compared to the case when we don't have a normalized sensitivity map. Now, while there's additional work that still needs to be done to further validate and test and characterize the performance of these ERT methods, at the same time, we've also been investigating the use of a data-driven approach to improve the performance and speed of our ERT inverse problem. Specifically, we've developed an artificial neural network with multiple layers in order to solve this nonlinear ERT problem, which we believe is and can be more computational and time efficient. So specifically, the ERT ANN system that we looked at consisted of 2 artificial neural networks, which we called ANN1 and ANN2. The first ANN, the goal of which is to localize which strut is damaged. And then upon identifying the broken strut, we can then focus in on that particular strut, run a second ANN2 in order to specifically localize the position where that breakage has occurred. So with limited time, I'll go through these pretty quickly, but I'll just say that for training ANN1, we looked at 1 undamaged case and 5,000 different damaged states. And we utilized 72 singular value decomposition processed inputs from our 504 boundary voltage measurements. The ANN architecture itself has 4 hidden layers, each with 2,048 neurons, and incorporated an exponential linear unit or ELU activation function. And again, the goal here of ANN1 is to identify which strut is damaged. The second ANN for training leveraged 1 undamaged state and 500 different damaged states, all within the strut itself. And it utilized 18 singular value decomposition processed inputs from, again, our 504 boundary voltage measurements. The ANN structure is similar to before with 4 hidden layers. And also uses an ELU activation function. And again, the goal of the second ANN is to localize where within each strut that damage is located. So to validate this particular method, we again utilize our structure here with damage created in strut 1 and in strut 2. So upon running ANN1, we can correctly identify the damaged strut, and ANN2 then gives us precisely the location where that film has been etched off. Similarly, for strut 2, right, we see strut 2 is damaged, and ANN2 gives us the portion of that strut where film has been etched off, where we simulated damage. So in conclusion, today I presented to you essentially 2 approaches to solving this 3D ERT problem for localizing defects in cellular lattice structures, where the first case utilized a model-based ERT method that incorporated a normalized sensitivity map to enhance damage detection performance. And in the second case, using a data-driven approach, specifically to artificial neural networks to not only localize which strut has broken, but also specifically where that damage is within each strut. In the future, we'll look at more damage scenarios and start to consider electrical impedance tomography, or EIT, that utilizes multiple frequencies of excitations. Finally, I'd like to thank the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and our collaborators for supporting this work. Thank you very much.